now. Fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm Kylea Tink, the federal member for North Sydney, and it is my very great pleasure to join you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land tonight, which is unusual for me because I'm usually on Gamaragal or Wallamata land. I want to acknowledge that I am on stolen land, that the title's never been ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Special respects to any elder on the call tonight. I believe we have an extraordinary opportunity coming up in the next few months, hopefully by the end of this year, to cast our vote as to whether each of us believes that First Nations people should be recognised in our Constitution and should have the capacity to have an enshrined voice in our Constitution, which means they would always have a say in any laws created that directly affect them. I think that's an amazing opportunity for us all. And I do hope you will join me in voting yes at that time. But that's a conversation for another night. I am very lucky tonight with federal parliament resuming. Of course, one of the hot topics in the legislative agenda down here is the safeguard mechanism. And knowing that climate was one of the number one reasons that I was sent here by the residents of North Sydney, and knowing how much conversation has been running through our community up until this point in time about what the legislation means and how it will work, I thought it was just too good an opportunity to actually gather some of the best and brightest in this space to talk to us directly about what is going on with this legislation. So joining us tonight, I'm actually going to start with Gabriella Warden. So Gabriella, will give everyone a wave. So Gabriella is actually the Manager of Research and Government Relations at the Carbon Market Institute. And we are very fortunate to have her here tonight, as we are to have her colleague Kurt Winter, who is the Director of Corporate Transition at the Carbon Market Institute. And then joining me here to my left, as I mentioned earlier, we have Gavin McFadden, who is actually the Manager for Climate Change and Clean Energy at the Australian Conservation Foundation. So three incredibly well-informed, intelligent people who really are here to help make sense of this legislation for us, the amendment to it and what it will mean. So I am going to start tonight actually with my first question to you, Gabriella, if you don't mind. Again, thank you for joining us. Can I just check that I can hear you?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's great. Gabrielle, so I'm going to start, with actually probably the most basic of the questions, or the straight up, because I think it's important we all start from the same position. Can you please just remind us what exactly the safeguard mechanism is?
Thanks, Kylie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. So good question to start, the safeguard mechanism. Basically, it's a policy that applies to Australia's largest emitters. So those are facilities with more than 100,000 tonnes of emissions annually. And there's currently 215-ish of those, which together emit around 28% of our national emissions. So collectively, these facilities make up what you hear called the industrial sector, but they actually undertake a range of different business activities. So there's mining facilities, steel, cement, aviation, and so on. And the safeguard was actually introduced in 2016 by the old coalition government, and it was supposed to put a cap on emissions from these facilities. And the way that it works is that these facilities have an emissions limit, which is called a baseline, and they're supposed to stick to that limit. And if they go over the baseline, they're supposed to buy Australian carbon credit units to remain compliant, or else they face a fine. But what has actually happened since 2016 is that because baselines have been set in a very sort of lenient way and been adjusted if facilities went over them, emissions under the safeguard haven't actually been capped, but they've sort of grown since 2016. So that's sort of the kind of background on the safeguard. And at the moment, the current Labor government wants to reform the safeguard mechanism so that baselines actually decline over time. So facilities will have to actually reduce their emissions. And so if a facility doesn't reduce its emissions, it'll have to purchase credits to remain compliant, same as before. But those baselines will reduce over time. And as part of the government's proposal, if it is, supported by both houses of parliament, Facilities that do reduce their emissions more than their baselines will earn safeguard mechanism credits. They can keep those to use in the future or sell them. And other facilities that have not reduced their emissions enough to meet their baseline will be able to buy these safeguard mechanism credits alongside the Australian carbon credit units that I mentioned earlier to offset their excess emissions and meet their declining baselines to remain compliant. There's a few differences between safeguard mechanism credits and the carbon credits I mentioned before. Safeguard mechanism credits are not an offset in the same way that the ACCUs are, but that's basically, how it is proposed to work. And at the moment, the bill before Parliament that's been debated in the House of Reps this week, that will allow the government to introduce those below baseline credits. I think that's an overview there.
Thank you, Gabriella. Can I just to be clear though, there's a hierarchy within this kind of idea of reducing credits, isn't there? So they're actually, because I think one of the things I've tried to get my head around is impact on true gross emissions versus netting out emissions through credit. So the first step is to try and get these emitters to actually change the way they do business to reduce gross emissions, isn't it?
I think, best practice, if you do have emissions reduction opportunities on hand, then that should be the first port of call. There aren't restrictions proposed within the safeguard, the reform proposal at the moment, to impose that sort of hierarchy. And there's several sort of reasons why that might be difficult to do. I guess as a best practice, the first step would be to reduce your emissions if you're able to. But I mentioned some of those industries before are in sectors where there might not be available solutions, and that's where they might need to actually rely on those safeguard mechanism credits from other facilities or the Australian carbon credit units as well.
Fantastic, which is a bit like you've just provided me for the perfect segue actually to Gavin. Gavin, I think that what we have seen is this piece of legislation grab lots of headlines and drive lots of content through social channels. There's been criticisms of the scheme. So as it's presented currently, what actually could be done to improve it? And, where has your focus been?
Yeah, thanks, Kylie, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I guess it's two sides of the same coin, really, in terms of like what are the problems are and how do we fix them. It'd be remiss of me not to say that initially this is a scheme that is working to a target that the environment movement thinks is too low. The 43% emissions reduction target of this federal government is a big improvement on the previous government, but it's still lower, as we all know, than the science says is required. If we want to stay under a 2-degree world, that target would need to be around 50%. For a 1.5-degree world, about 74%. So the scheme's working to a lower level of ambition than we would like. And it's not covering as much of the economy as we would like. It's covering 215 companies, about 28% of Australia's emissions. And we'd like to see a broader scheme than that. And that's partly because we're inheriting the scheme from the Abbott government. We're not designing it from scratch. And if we were, we probably wouldn't be looking at a scheme like this. So we're just trying to make many improvements as we can. And so is Kylie and the other Teal Independents through the amendments they're putting through the Parliament right now. So what are some of the improvements we'd like to see? You might have heard a fair bit about offsets in the last couple of months. So we think that the federal government is proposing unlimited offsets. So if you've got a business that qualifies for the safeguard, you can pay for offsets generated by planting trees or savanna burning in Northern Australia or waste project or so forth. You don't necessarily have to reduce the emissions on your site or at your facility level. And we think that's really important because there's kind of a hierarchy of abatement. The best way to have a good impact on climate change and reduce emissions is by reducing emissions on site, actually at the business level. And if you can't do that, we would like to see we'd like to see them do everything they can to avoid their emissions and then minimise them through changing their business practices on site, not reducing production, but producing fewer emissions with the production they've got. And then look at ways of either buying carbon credits and, as a last resort, offsets. We think offsets play an important role, but they're the least effective and least permanent and most risky way of doing emissions reduction. So we think they play an important role, but we don't think they should play such a dominant role in the scheme. Also, the scheme doesn't really deal with coal and gas projects. And we know that coal and gas, the burning of coal and gas here and overseas, is the #1 cause of climate change. Now, there could be some impacts of the scheme on reducing the prospectivity of coal projects, but it doesn't really deal with what we call new coal and gas entrants. And there are about 118 on the books. And we calculate that even about 16 of them, if they went ahead, and I'm thinking they're like Beetaloo Gas Basin, Barossa, Browse. If they go ahead, we're worried that they will overwhelm the scheme. They'll kind of blow it out of the water, and Australia won't meet its 43% emissions reduction target. So we're calling on the government to make sure those companies enter the scheme at net zero by purchasing carbon credits and offsets so that they don't overwhelm the scheme. The other thing we're concerned about on that front is that by allowing new coal and gas into the system, we're making life harder for other industries that we want to see stay in the Australian economy long term. So think like cement, other forms of manufacturing, smelting and so forth. We think they have a future in the Australian economy, but they're high emissions. And so they need to get them down. But their job's been made harder by having coal and gas in the system because we've got to accommodate the emissions of all of them. Then we need to look at the government is making a financial contribution to help make this scheme work through the Powering the Regions Fund. And we want to see some tightening there too. So we want to see the federal government make sure that companies can't purchase offsets using public money. We think that Rio Tinto, for example, should be able to pay its own way on emissions reduction, and so should fossil fuel companies. So we don't think the fossil fuel companies should have any access to the Powering the Regions Fund. The Powering Regions Fund should be for companies that we want to see stay in the Australian economy and be internationally competitive and get their emissions down over time. Not companies, not coal and gas companies that we need to see rapidly exit the Australian economy. So they're probably, is my time up? They're probably about it, Kylie. In terms of the improvements we want to see, they're probably the big ones.
Well, and I guess just before I kick on to Kurt, what I would ask, we've been negotiating this for a long time now, you know, and I think the reality is, everyone on this call, just so you know, the draft legislation was brought forward, and pretty much from the minute the draft legislation landed, myself and others here, whether they're on the crossbench as community independents or from the Greens Party, we have been working directly with the Minister and his team to see what opportunities there are to strengthen this legislation, because fundamentally my understanding and my belief is that this legislation can work. We need it to work.
Yeah.
So when you hear the Minister in the chamber saying we need to pass this so we can begin, that's not an unfair statement from him, is it?
No, we think it should be improved and strengthened in a whole range of ways, and that's your role, the Greens' role, and that's what groups like ACF do, lobby and inform people like Kylea and others to suggest reforms to improve it. And we think that should happen. The Greens also kind of had a legitimate position on no new coal and gas because we know that needs to exit the system. But if that can't happen through the safeguard should go ahead, and we need to look at other ways of phasing out coal and gas rapidly, if not through the safeguard mechanism. And finally, we've got a review. It's got a review built in 2 to 3 years. We think it should be sooner rather than later so that we can pull those levers to make sure the scheme's working properly. So if that's kind of what you're saying, we shouldn't necessarily make the perfect the enemy of the good now. We should get a system in, improve it as much as we can, and then use the review in a couple of years to make sure it's on a trajectory to deliver our targets.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks, mate.
So I spoke in the House last night. So one of the unusual things that has happened down here in Canberra is they actually extended the sitting times till 10 o'clock in the House of Reps so that we could get through more people. And I gave my what's called a second reading speech last night. in that second reading speech, I actually moved for some amendments to the bill, which specifically focused on the government fully committing to and fully funding all of the recommendations that came out of the Chubb review. Now, the Chubb review is not perfect. I know that there has still been criticism of the Chubb review, but from my perspective, I've looked at it as a flaw to kind of say, look, if the government can at least move on this, we know we'll be moving it forward. So that amendment will be voted on as attached to that bill, I would imagine, in the coming days. I don't expect it to get through, but the important part is that North Sydney is on record saying we want to see more integrity around what we call the Australian Carbon Credit Units. I kept saying unions yesterday. I was so tired. I kept struggling. Or ACCUs, as they're otherwise
Just say
known.
ACCUs.
So, Hugh, Kurt, I want to come to you now off the back of that. So, given the background that Gabriella has given us and what we've just heard from Gavin, can the safeguard mechanism actually do what we need it to do to bring our emissions down so that we can hit net zero by 2050?
Yeah, a really good question. And I think it's important to recognise that it's a really important starting point. I don't think it is a complete solution, but it is certainly an important mechanism within a suite of measures that are needed in order to achieve not only the 43% target, but also more ambitious targets into the future. And I guess just sort of stepping through it, many of you might have seen that the international panel released its final report on the science, which really spoke to the urgency of a range of actions that are needed, from everything from retiring coal through to clean energy investment, decarbonising aviation and shipping, dealing with some of these sectors that are covered by this mechanism, such as steel, cement, but also looking at things like the agricultural sector and the way that we deal with food and waste. And obviously this scheme doesn't deal with that broad suite of measures. So I think though, sort of looking at what's on the table here, as Gabriella mentioned, it does target the 215 highest polluting facilities, and it really focuses in on their direct emissions that are associated with production, and that's quite important. And what's been proposed is that each year, those facilities will face a declining baseline of 4.9%, which year those facilities will have to either reduce emissions by nearly 5%, or indeed they will have to face the cost of purchasing credits. I think, as I mentioned at the start, more will be needed though, and this needs to be situated within a broader suite of measures. This is particularly around some of the points that Gavin raised about, those sectors around fossil fuels. If Australia is serious about a transition away from those sectors, we actually need to confront what are the broader kind of transition questions on how we move from high emitting sectors towards the kind of sectors that will be needed in the future. And that is a very complex question that will not only need considerations about how do we deal with workforce, how do we deal with that sort of transition, but how do we actually create these new sectors and incentivize them? So I think you kind of need both. And I think the government does need to put in place probably other additional processes beyond the safeguard to address that. One way they could do that is to actually focus attention on establishing sort of an independent transition authority that could actually provide advice on these kind of questions, and also could provide advice on what additional incentives or regulations are needed to kind of phase down some of those sectors, but also incentivize the new sectors that are needed. One of the other key, I guess, elements of this ecosystem that has been talked about a lot is the actual approval of these high emitting facilities in the first place. And I think it's important to recognise that the safeguard mechanism is a market mechanism. It's actually designed to create a kind of efficiency in the transition away from those high polluting sort of activities and incentivise investment in different processes. It's actually not very well designed to deal with the approvals in the first place. that's kind of a different question that I think is best dealt with through things like the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Currently, that act does not adequately deal with this question of climate impact. And again, I think that's another area where the government could establish an adjacent process to actually deal with that with a range of stakeholders and experts. I think looking more broadly, we did talk earlier about the target setting, and I think it's important to recognise this is a significant step forward from, you know, the national ambition that we had set with the previous government, but it isn't aligned to the Paris Agreement yet. And so the Carbon Market Institute has advocated that this mechanism should really be aligned more to a sort of 50% target. But indeed, we've also said publicly that there is a need to move beyond that. And so in 2035, nationally, we should be looking more at a kind of 70% target in order to align with the science, but also Australia's fair share of what's required to meet that global abatement task. And I think it's important to recognise politically that that ambition does need to ratchet up over time. So we've also said publicly that there's opportunity for this scheme to scale as you know, as that ambition scales as well. And that's, I guess, one of the important aspects of bedding this down, that we can kind of set ambition now, but then expand the scheme in future, for example, to smaller facilities or indeed to other sectors, which won't be without complexity, but certainly that's where this needs to be moving.
Kurt, I think that is one of the things that I've really had to try and wrap my head around, because the reality is the 215 companies or facilities that this legislation currently captures are very different, other than the fact that they all are emitting above 100,000 megatons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. But we are talking about cement manufacturers, steel manufacturers. And in fact, one of the conversations I had and will continue to have with the climate minister, I spoke about it last night in the House, was why they, you know, we aren't ratcheting down that target. So we might start at 100,000, but why not kick it back 25,000 every 5 years? So, you know, we go from 100,000 to 75,000 to 50,000 to 25,000. And I think there is broad recognition that that's the sort of planning we do need to see. It's not just about what we do in the next 3 to 5 years. It needs to be in the next 2 decades. What are we doing? The interesting fact that he and his staff shared with me was actually to drop it from 100,000 to 25,000. They were saying it actually only picks up about another 3% of industry. So, you know, we'd still only be dealing with that 30% in total. So it's been a really interesting conversation for me to have had with him. Just so everyone knows, when this bill comes back into the House, which is, I think they're hoping to get it back into the House of Reps tomorrow, so there can be a vote in the House of Reps, I will move further amendments in what's called consideration in detail. And the amendments that I will move actually relate specifically to what Gavin was talking to about us earlier, that the regional fund cannot be given to fossil fuel projects to help them decarbonise, so that the regional funding that's being provided is actually focused in on those industries that we wish to keep in our country, who will find it really hard. Cement, steel, iron, you know, there still needs to be technology development. But from my perspective, there are pretty big, easy wins on the table for the gas companies and the coal companies, and they make a lot of money. So they really shouldn't need federal funding to help them to do that. So that will definitely be one of the amendments that I will try and move. And I will still move the amendment arguing that we should be ratcheting down the target. I don't expect that to be accepted by the government. But I am very hopeful that we will see some movement around the stipulation that government funds can't be directed towards fossil fuel projects. I should also say, obviously, once the legislation comes back into the House, it then goes from us through to the Senate, and I'm sure there'll be lots of further negotiations in the Senate. So I can see that we've had one question in the chat, so I'm going to go to that quickly. We also had a number of questions lodged before tonight, which is what we'd asked, so I'll try and whip through these really fast. But the question that's been put to us is, what is your sense of Labor's position given the obvious mandate from the last election for urgent action and the recent IPCC report? What are they doing? I guess it depends where you're in the bubble. So I'm going to, from my point of view in the bubble, so sitting in the chamber, I can tell you there's been lots of discussions around the IPCC report as it landed at, I think it was midnight on Tuesday night, wasn't it, Gav? Monday night. And a lot of pressure around what does a planned transition look like for our country. I know in every opportunity I've been given in the last 48 hours, I have actually reiterated this point that more than any other government in the last 130 years, this government has a very clear mandate to take faster action on climate. I think we are going to have to continue to hold them to account for that, though, because they are juggling competing interests, I guess, and they are actually dealing with a challenging task, which is now trying to re-gear our economy in a very short time frame. We should have been doing this over the last 2 decades, not just now in this term. But Gav, do you want to comment on what you think where Labor's at?
And before I say that, can I just say too that we were actually really disappointed that the coalition didn't engage in this debate at all.
Yeah.
Like they said no to the safeguard mechanism and said no, particularly the bill, before they'd even seen it. And we thought that was pretty poor form in terms of what we thought that political parties should have learned from the last federal election. So first thing to say is we're disappointed that the coalition's not even playing ball in the parliament on this policy. When it comes to Labor's position, as I said, it is a big improvement on the safeguard mechanism design under the coalition, but we did think some of these design flaws were pretty obvious, and we actually were a little bit. I recognise the effort, and they've done a lot of work to create this design, and we really welcome that from Minister Bowen. They've done an enormous amount of work, but we did think that some of those pretty obvious loopholes should have been closed a bit sooner, and they should have brought more to the table, to be honest. And some of the amendments that Kylie's had to bring and the other Teals and the Greens are negotiating should really have been design improvements. It should have been in the original design. It shouldn't really have been for Parliament to try to close all these loopholes. So I'm glad they've brought it on, and I'm glad that they're getting on with the job of emissions reduction policy, but we wish they brought something more ambitious in the first instance, and we'd work from there.
I can see then we've had a question from Jane, who has long history in this space, saying, why is the government so lacking in ambition given that they have a majority and there is strong support for rapid climate action? It's
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, one is that Labor's sort of tipping their toe a bit into the water here. They want to see a scheme that can work, and then they want to, as I said, use the review in a couple of years to really tighten it and pull the levers to make it work. So there's a few unknowns with this scheme. How many safeguard mechanism credits, how many carbon credits will actually be in the system, how will the offsets work, how will new businesses and facilities actually engage with this scheme. So in some defence of Labor, there are quite a few unknowns about how this is really going to work when it hits the road. So Labor would argue that they've got to stay a bit lower ambition and go from there. But as I said, we wish they'd gone a lot harder and faster. And as I said, they'll have to deal with the coal and gas question. And as Kurt mentioned, that's probably better done through reforms to the EPBC Act, the Environment, Biodiversity and Conservation Act, later this year.
And actually on that, because one of the questions we had, which is what's next in climate policy for Australia. And Kurt, I do want to come back to you here on this one, because I know one of the things that's become increasingly clear to me sitting in this seat is that it is important that we keep this piece of legislation in context, in that it is one piece of legislation. This is not going to be the sole answer for everything we need to do. We do have EBC reform. We do have stuff coming in. So Kurt, can you talk a little bit more about, what else we should be expecting to see, for what levers we'll be working with this government to pull to get faster action on climate?
Yeah, so I think just thinking about the industrial sector in particular, another really significant reform that is already underway is around transparency and disclosure of climate risks. So some companies are already quite advanced in how they talk about how they're dealing with climate change and how they're, adjusting their business to that new reality. But it is also the case that some businesses are very poor in how they do that. And in Australia currently, there is no mandatory standardized process to kind of expect what companies do and don't report. So at the moment, Treasury is consulting on that, and they're looking to introduce a standardized reporting framework. It will be likely targeted at initially large companies, and then will extend across the economy. So I think that would be really important. And if you look at how that's played out in some overseas jurisdictions, for example, in the UK and the US, it's actually going a little bit further than that. It's actually requiring companies to report on what is their transition plan, which means that they have to give details about things like to what extent are they decarbonising, to what extent are they relying on offsets, where are the business opportunities, does this company actually really have a lot of value in a net zero emissions world? So I think that will be really important, and it will be important that the government gets that framework right to ensure that it's aligned with what our overseas markets kind of expect. The other, I guess, really critical piece is around sectoral transition. And as you mentioned, Kylie, this is covering quite a broad cross-section of sectors. Even though we say it's the industrial sector, what sits underneath that is a very broad suite of different subsectors, ranging from mining through to cement through to oil and gas. So I think the government really does need to develop more targeted sector-specific policies on how each of those sectors can kind of accelerate forward. Part of that will be around innovation and developing appropriate funding opportunities, including through some of the funding that is on the table through this mechanism to actually drive those investments to take place. The other really important reform will be about the sectors that aren't covered by the safeguard mechanism. So as I mentioned at the outset, transport will be really important. At the moment, there is some policy around EVs, but it doesn't really deal with the full sector in terms of heavy vehicle transport. Aviation will be really important, and in the aviation space, there is discussion around things like sustainable aviation fuels, but at the moment there really isn't an appropriate framework to actually support that in its development. And then the other really important one is really around agriculture. There is not really a clear target for that sector or indeed a pathway as to how that sector will be transitioned. So there are a lot of moving parts. I did also mention that sort of piece around how you move away from the high emitting sectors and whether there's a need for a more robust kind of approval process for new industrial facilities. But again, I think this is an important starting point, especially for the production that's associated with these facilities. So, yeah.
It's fascinating. I think one of the things that this week I've had an opportunity to do is to meet with a number of businesses, Australian businesses, that are actually doing incredible work developing components of innovative new technology that we will need going forward. Whether it is Wollongong University was here earlier this week taking me through the technology that they've developed to actually be able to generate hydrogen from water. Arguably they are right at the cutting edge of that. And the conversation we had is, how do we make sure it doesn't go the way of the solar cell? Where arguably the basic technology of the solar cell came out of the University of New South Wales, but we lost it overseas so quickly. So I think the point you make make there, Kurt, is a really important one. It's that I think the more I can hold this government to account in looking at this always from the place of opportunity versus cost, then the further we'll get faster. Because, Jane, back to your original question, what do I still believe fundamentally, unfortunately for all of us, fear is a very mobilizing emotion. And to be optimistic and brave in an environment where there are those who would seek to control through fear is a tough thing to do in some circumstances, but that's why we have the incredible crossbench we have, and I'm so grateful that you all sent me to be your member for North Sydney. Gabriella, I just want to come back to you because we're going to wrap up now. I mean, given everything we've talked about tonight, if there was one message that you could leave for both those people that have joined us tonight and those that I know will, catch up on the recording, what would you say to this group of really highly engaged people around this piece of legislation and what we need to do moving forward?
I think, just to sum it up, stay engaged. I think there is good reason to stay really hopeful. As we've sort of discussed today, this, proposed reform to the safeguard, it's not perfect. There's a lot of, room for improvement. Kylea and the other Teals and Greens and other members of Parliament are doing a really good job pushing the government to make those improvements. So, just stay engaged, be hopeful, and keep watching.
I'm going to go the same order we started with. Gav, what would you say?
Well, I'd probably go gratuitous and say join ACF, but
there's no endorsement, there's no advertising in this forum.
I mean, and if not ACF, do what you're doing. If you're supporting Kylie and her work, that's making as someone who rocks around this place quite a bit, the work of Kylie and other independents is just essential at holding power to account and pushing both of the major parties in particular to do better. So however you're engaging on climate change, I'm really grateful personally for you doing it. So thanks for all the work you do on climate action, no matter what that is, small or large, whether it's donating, signing a petition, writing letters, turning up and informing yourselves at webinars like this. But certainly you can join your local conservation group. If that's not ACF, join another one. And that way you get the avenue to get more involved in public advocacy in Australia around climate and other issues. And it means that when people like me are in Parliament, we've got a lot more power. The power of environment groups like ours is only through our members and our members' support. So you can always find your local environment group or a big one like ours and sign up and support them, and they'll guide you in ways to be most effective in pushing for stronger climate action with our federal parliament.
Well said. And Kurt, your closing words?
Yeah, I totally agree with Gabby that it's important to stay engaged and informed. And I agree with you, Kylie, as well. It is a really massive opportunity for Australia. I think we have a lot of people who are deeply engaged, but also a lot of innovation within Australia in the business space and in terms of startups where Australia can really lead the world in this transition and provide massive economic opportunities for new industries and new sectors. So I think it's really important that the community stays engaged and keeps pushing for that transition. That is really essential.
Well said, well said. So can everyone please join me in thanking our three speakers tonight, to Gabriella Warden, to Kurt Winter, and to our amazing Gavin McFadden, who's sitting here with me. I guess I actually do have a ask from my end, and this may be a bit controversial, but there is a state election coming up on Saturday in New South Wales, and we have a number of excellent independents running across a number of seats that intersect with the federal seat of North Sydney and beyond. And I do believe that having independents in this federal house has made a difference already to the sort of legislation that we are seeing coming through and passing. Please talk to your friends and share the story that every square must have a number in it on the weekend. Don't let a vote die because in New South Wales there is that opportunity to just put a number one. We are not a party, and I know every single person on this call is very aware of that. But I've got to say, the thing that actually made me laugh out loud in the house today, and I'm not supposed to laugh out loud, but somebody actually sent me a copy of the latest Liberal campaign advertising, and it is a teal tile trying to say that you only have to put one on the paper with then the party title very small on the bottom. Now that says to me that the current government is worried that there is actually going to be true change coming through in New South Wales. Our absolute best chance of change on a really, truly revolutionary scale is reform across all levels of government. And, you know, I'm really very much looking forward to this coming weekend to see what comes of that. So, as always, thank you so much for your engagement. The team is here. Please continue keeping us up to date with how you're thinking, how you're feeling. I'll keep fighting down here and having the conversations that we need to have on behalf of North Sydney. I do expect that the legislation will come back into the House and the vote will take place at that point in time. But, you know, it ain't over until it's actually through the House. So we'll keep swinging to make it as good as we possibly can. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a nice night.